Hello and welcome to this video, Microbiological Criteria of Foods. Now this is the 26th in a series of 100 videos on UK food law topics. My name's Andy Bowles and I'm a food lawyer. Now you may be watching this video as part of our online training service, and if that's the case then you can go and have a look if you want to a 1-hour webinar on this topic which gives a far more detail, plus there are some documents you can download. Of course you might be watching this on our YouTube channel, which is absolutely fine. Okay, so the microbiological criteria of foodstuffs regulations are hygiene regulations, and in the general hygiene regulations there's an obligation that food business operators must comply with these standards. However, there is also an obligation in general food hygiene regulations for food business operators to have put in place and implement a system based on HACCP principles, and of course there is a separate video on HACCP principles. But the point I want to make here is really about the purpose of these regulations. Now, as the name suggests, the microbiological criteria of foodstuffs regulations, quite a mouthful, set criteria for microbiological organisms in food. But one of the primary purposes of doing this is to identify certain food organisms so that as part of your system based on HACCP principles, you can put in place effective controls to ensure that those named microorganisms are actually appropriately controlled. So the main purpose of these regulations is to inform the systems based on HACCP principles process. But the regulations also set these as standards, and so enforcement officers may come and sample your foods, send them off to a food examiner where they'll be examined for microbiological quality, and of course the food examiner, the microbiologist, will use these regulations to interpret the results. So that's the point of these regulations really. Now the regulations set out two sets of microbiological criteria: food safety criteria and process hygiene criteria. Now these are very different in nature. The food safety criteria will actually list out named pathogens, in other words food poisoning bacteria such as salmonella, for example, listeria. What they'll do is identify those bacteria and they will set a standard. The standard in a food safety criteria list is in fact just absence. So they'll say, for example, salmonella shall be absent. What they'll also do in this particular criteria is identify the foodstuff of concern. So the food safety criteria are all about the food that is placed on the market until the end of its shelf life, and the standards relate to food poisoning bacteria. The process hygiene criteria are a bit different to that. What they do is actually identify what are known as indicator microorganisms. Now, indicator microorganisms like the Enterobacteriaceae, for example, a really long word, that one. The Enterobacteriaceae is a family of bacteria. Most of the family of the Enterobacteriaceae are perfectly harmless. They live in the gut normally of humans. They're not really going to cause any problem. There are a few dysfunctional members of the Enterobacteriaceae family, like Salmonella and E. coli, for example, that do cause problems. And so what we do is we use the family Enterobacteriaceae as an indicator. So we look for members of that family and we make the judgment, look, if you've got some pretty harmless members of the family present, well then the conditions are right for the less harmful, the more problematic members of the family to actually flourish. So the process hygiene criteria set out standards for these indicator organisms on the process itself, not on the food. So the process should be sufficient to kill off the indicators, and of course if it can kill off the indicators it will kill off the problematic bacteria. That's the sort of principle here. So, because they're different in nature, the food safety criteria are of the greatest concern. Food safety criteria, remember, relate to the food poisoning bacteria. Typically standards would be presence or absence, obviously absence being preferable. If you have a product that's placed on the market and it fails the food safety criteria as set out in these regulations. So if it's a specified food and it contains salmonella, for example, then that food is unsafe in accordance with the general food regs. So there is a separate video on unsafe foods and must be withdrawn and recalled from the market, depending on the circumstance. Again, there are separate videos on each of those topics. Okay, so the regulations place an obligation on food business operators to take measures as part of the systems based on HACCP principles to implement good hygiene practice and make sure the process hygiene criteria are met. Remember, those are the criteria that relate to the process itself. And the food safety criteria must be met under reasonably foreseeable conditions. So this is distribution, storage and use. So with the food safety criteria, it's not just assessing whether the food will be safe whilst it's in the factory or whilst it's in the kitchen. It's will it be safe throughout its shelf life, reasonably foreseeable conditions. If necessary, these regulations force businesses to conduct studies on their food. Other videos explain microbiological growth. Other videos, I've got one on shelf life, which sort of explains very briefly the effect of things like pH, water activity on shelf life, and indeed the shelf life time itself. So all of these issues may need to be considered by a food business operator. If they're placing on the market a food that's subject to the food safety criteria, they may need to conduct some studies using an analyst, microbiologist to try and determine whether their food will be safe throughout its shelf life. Okay, well, the regulations set out specific microbiological criteria, and there's 3 chapters. Ignore the last chapter, that's more to do with fresh meat and we're not going to deal with that, but it's the food safety criteria set out in chapter 1 and the process hygiene criteria that I'm going to briefly review. Now, the food safety criteria list out food poisoning microorganisms of real concern. The ones that are sort of the headliners here will be Listeria monocytogenes, Salmonella, Chronobacter. Now, Chronobacter is a bacteria that's associated with infant formulae, E. coli, but also Staphylococca enterotoxins. Staphylococci enterotoxins are produced by coagulase positive staphylococci. Oh my god, that all sounds a terrible mouthful. Basically, a coagulase positive staphylococci, there is a separate video on those. We're talking about bacteria like Staphylococcus aureus, Staph aureus. They can produce, if they are present in large numbers, a toxin. And it's not really the bacteria that's the big issue, it's the toxin that's the issue. And histamine, there is a separate video which I deal with histamine as well. So the sampling plans that are set out in the chapters. So chapter 1, the food safety criteria. There are sampling plans. Now it's behind me. It looks like a bus timetable. Very complicated. But actually, if you look at it carefully, it's not that complicated. We have 2 types of sampling plan. What are called 2-class attribute plans and 3-class attribute plans. Food safety criteria are 2-class attribute plans. What that means is they only have 2 classes, 2 answers to the question. Is this safe? Yes or no. Is this present? Yes or no. Present or absence. So these 2 classes, yes, no, presence, absence, refer to the food poisoning bacteria, the food safety criteria. So you'll see in these sampling plans, you've got things like products with presence of Salmonella, for example, then it will be absence. That's the standard. Now, for the process hygiene criteria, we use a 3-class attribute plan. So in other words, it's not just a question of yes or no. Remember, with the process hygiene criteria, we're looking at indicator microorganisms, things like Enterobacteriaceae. So there, we don't just bring in the yes, no, pass, fail. We bring in the yes, no, okay. So there's a middle category. So here, the sampling plans use a number of symbols to explain this. First of all, you'll have a little n for November. N is the number of samples. Typically, you'll have like 5 samples. Then you'll have a little m for mother, a big M for mother. So the big M is the limit of acceptability. So in other words, if you get a sampling result, you take 5 samples, n equals 5, and any one of those 5 samples exceeds the value of big M, then it fails because big M is the highest value. With this 3-class attribute plan, if you take 5 samples, but you get 1 or all 5 at little m, that's okay. Okay, it's acceptable. But you know, ideally you want as low as possible, but little m is a value that's okay. Between little m and big M, we have a value called C. And that's the number of samples that you're allowed to have in this sort of no man's land. So if I just explain that again, we take 5 samples, n equals 5. We find 1 sample is above big M, then the whole lot fails. If we have 5 samples and all the samples are little m or below, everything passes. If we have 5 samples, but we have a number of samples between the little m value and the big M value, well, as long as that does not exceed the number of no man's land samples, C, then that will be okay. So let's put it out on a little graph, just to try and explain it a bit better. The food safety criteria, you take 5 samples, you can see them on there, 5 crosses. One of them is wrong. So we have, remember, in food safety criteria, like salmonella, it's absence or presence. Absence is okay, presence is unacceptable. If just one of your samples out of those 5 falls into the unacceptable category, the whole lot fails. So if you are producing your food safety HACCP, your systems based on HACCP principles, when you identify salmonella, you put in place a control that's going to achieve acceptable results every time. That's what you need. For the process hygiene criteria, we've got unsatisfactory, satisfactory, and acceptable in the middle, the no man's land. Remember, if you look at the chart behind me, the big M is the maximum value. Little m is the acceptable level. Below that, so we take 5 samples and they're all quite low levels of Enterobacteriaceae, for example. They all fall within the satisfactory category. Then that is a satisfactory result. Everybody's happy. If n is 5 samples, but little c is 2, then we're allowed 2 of the results to fall within no man's land. So there we can see 3 of them are satisfactory, 2 of them are a little higher levels of Enterobacteriaceae, but they've not gone beyond big M. They're in that no man's land. That is acceptable. That's okay. But if we get into 3 within the unacceptable in no man, if C equals 2, so C is the number of samples you're allowed in no man's land between little m and big M, then if we hit 3, that's unacceptable. So that would be a failure. If we took 5 samples and one of them exceeds the big M value, that would be unacceptable. So there, the whole lot would fail. So that's how it works. On the food safety criteria, you have this presence or absence. If you look on, I mean, it's very small here. If you're watching this on my online training service, you can download these and look at them in a bit more detail. But if you look at, say, 1 down 1.4, minced meat and meat preparations intended to be eaten raw, that's the food identified. The food poisoning bacteria is salmonella. The standard is absence. So that's it. It says, where does it apply? Products placed on the market. So therefore, the presence of salmonella there in a microbiological test would be a failure. For process hygiene criteria, if you look at the top one, pasteurized milk, we've got the Enterobacteriaceae, the family of bacteria indicators. We've got N, little n is 5, C is 0, but we've got little m and we've got big M. On that one, they've decided just to put 10. So they've actually made it on that one that you've merged the 2 together. So you can only have up to 10 Enterobacteriaceae identified in this test for it to pass. If you look at the next one, you've got cheese made from from milk that has undergone heat treatment. E. coli, another indicator. It's not E. coli 157, it's just E. coli. N is 5 samples. C is 2. Little m is 100 colony forming units per gram. Big M is 1,000 colony forming units per gram. So if you put it on that little graph I did earlier on, it's saying 5 samples. If any of those samples come back more than 1,000 colony forming units per gram, it's a failure. The whole lot fails. If they all come in at 100 or less, then it all passes, but you're allowed 2 between 100 and 1000, and then that will be okay. It says, when does it apply? At the time during the manufacturing process. And what do you do if you get a failure? Remember the food safety criteria? I said if it fails, you have to bring it back. No, here, you just need to go and look and find out why it's going wrong. What you're doing is you're identifying a failure in the process, but you're not identifying anything wrong with the food. So improvements in production hygiene need to be put in place. Okay, thanks for listening to that video. It's just 1 out of 100, so there are 99 more, and hopefully join you on the next one. Thank you for listening.